Welcome to the Customary Land podcast. I'm your host, Spike Boydell. The Customary Land podcast is about all things relating to the equitable management of customary land. We discuss tools and ideas needed to manage, use, and equitably maximise interests in land at the interface of custom, tradition, and development in its many forms. The Customary Land podcast is for everyone living on, identifying with, and wanting to use or access resources in or on customary land. In today's episode, I want to talk about ultimately the plurality of registers. What I mean by that is the different understandings and conceptions between customary understanding and Western understanding when it comes to land. To get us to the plurality of registers, I want to start by taking us to a very topical subject, which is the coronation of King Charles III of England, something which is due to happen tomorrow at the time of recording and last week at the time of publishing this podcast. I'm also going to use that to discuss what happened last month for a group of us at Customary Land Solutions, where we were involved in a proposal for a review team for the Great Council of Chiefs in Fiji. So I'm going to look at contemporary monarchy, contemporary aristocracy, and also take us into then some perspectives and views of the Melanesian Indigenous Land Defence Alliance, MILDA, and a conversation from Joel Simo, or Symoh Joel, as he appears on Facebook these days, to discuss a sense of meaning in customary land. That will then help me build on issues surrounding the problem I think we have of a plurality of registers, which is different worldviews. It's all tied up with myth, embeddedness, and tradition. And nothing is perhaps more embedded in tradition than what we see occurring with the coronation of King Charles III of England, who, coincidentally, has been pronounced King Charles III of all Australia, and obviously all parts of the former empire. Now, in 2023, I find it quite strange that people are prepared to accept this level of tradition and embeddedness. I've published and written on matters of the Republic here in Australia, and even our Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, who is in England for the coronation as the Prime Minister of a country which is headed by King Charles III. So interesting as well, because Anthony Albanese is a declared Republican. A Republican here in Australia means something different to that in the States. I need to make that distinction. A Republican in Australia is someone who is in favour of Australia becoming a republic. And he's made comments about this, Anthony Albanese has, in the recent days, talking about how, as head of state, as Prime Minister, should I say, it's important that he acknowledges the fact that King Charles III has oversight here in Australia, in its sort of colonial context. Despite it being a federation, it was granted its federation by Queen Victoria. So, here we are, 2023, and I'm seeing messages from university contemporaries or college contemporaries of mine from the UK, who are saying the scene is set, the world is waiting, with a view to the fact there's going to be an amazing amount of pomp and circumstance surrounding the coronation, not least of all sort of being towed around in a golden carriage. There's a sense that some people love this stuff in the UK, tend to be drawn, I would suggest, more from the right of politics, and conservatives or neoconservatives, neoliberals, who are incredibly hung up on these sorts of ceremonies and maintaining, in many ways, the status quo. And so I was shocked, as I say, to see a post from a former college friend of mine who was posting pictures of a rehearsal saying, the scene is set, the world is waiting. Well, actually, I think the world is waiting for the demise of the monarchy in the UK. Certainly, when one has travelled around the world and one has lived in countries other than England, you become somewhat aware of a strained relationship to what was, particularly in a country like Australia, where we've observed huge harm undertaken in the name of king and country, queen and country, to the Indigenous people. And we also see this elsewhere in the Pacific. I'll get to this in a moment, because we have supplanted monarchy, or supplanted aristocracy, should I say, in various countries. And when I first started working in Fiji in the late 1990s, and other Pacific Island countries I visited at that time, I was always shocked to go into public buildings and find, even though these countries had become republics in the 20 to 30 years before, from 1970 perhaps onwards, we were seeing pictures of Queen Elizabeth II in these public buildings. And of course, they were colonies of England or of Britain over the decades. And the response I had from people I questioned about the fact that it seemed very strange to me that here we were in a country that was a new republic with a picture of a queen in a public building. And they said, yes, but she was a good chief. We respect her because she was a good chief. Or was it just because nobody took down the picture? Curious, particularly given the fact that obviously, and the circumstances which I've touched on in previous podcasts, the circumstances surrounding the ceding of Fiji, for example, to Queen Victoria back in the 1870s. So here we are with a coronation occurring, and we read that England is the only country where the monarch actually goes for a coronation process. Well, that's because in other European countries where there is a monarch, they've modernized and they've moved with the times, and they're not perhaps so embedded in the tradition to swear an oath of fealty in honor of one's king in the hope that they live forever, which is a ridiculous thing to say, because a king or a queen is a mere mortal who, as his mother and grandmother did, will die. He's in his 70s, so he will presumably pass within the next 20 years or so. So how can we wish that he reigns forever, and that we pay also due homage and fealty to his heirs and successors. I find, quite a preposterous notion for any right-thinking individual in 2023. So I might get some flack for that, but it segues me into the fact that last month, at short notice, we, within the team of Customary Land Solutions, found ourselves crafting a proposal as a prospective review team for the Great Council of Chiefs. The Great Council of Chiefs in Fiji functioned as the apex body in the Fijian, the iTaukei, administration from 1945 until its disestablishment by the Bainimarama-led former government in 2012. Now, the GCC mandate was for the good governance and well-being of the iTaukei, centred on the Vanua and native lands, as well as scrutinising legislation and policies that affect the iTaukei. Since its disestablishment, some 37 legislations or decrees were promulgated which potentially marginalised the iTaukei. Now, I think we put in a very robust proposal, well considered and well crafted and realistic and achievable. We were not the successful team, and in hindsight, that's absolutely fine. I think there's a number of lessons to learn from that. The team that has been selected is one led by Dr. Jone Balindroka, a team of 7, all somewhat chiefly in their heritage and background, and realistically, with the benefit of hindsight, quite an obvious choice over our small team, which brought a different set of skills and would have come up inevitably with a different perspective, especially when I've premised what I've spoken of in terms of my thinking there is an inappropriate moment in UK's history for there still to be a monarch ruling over not just England, Ireland, Scotland, Wales, but also over the broader former colonies and the former empire, because of the damage that has occurred through the doing things in the name of the empire, the plundering. I mean, that's why empires existed. They were not set up just to give everybody a better quality of life in all the countries that became part of said empire. It was an expansionist policy, not just obviously from England at the time. It happened with countries like Papua New Guinea, which I'll touch on later, which fell under the auspices of the UK, then Germany, then Australia, and countries, as I will also touch on, like Vanuatu, another country in Melanesia, that was a condominium arrangement with interests from both the UK and France. And then you've got other countries like New Caledonia, which are very much still colonies, but completely plundered for its nickel. And the Kanak population have been striving for independence, but it hasn't been successful in the iterations towards independence so far, because France really doesn't want it to happen. Now, talking about the GCC, but I'm going to go back to the English situation, and it has been said by both Queen Elizabeth II and Charles III in his role as Prince Charles that they would accept the view of the Australian people, should the Australian people choose to become a republic, but actions perhaps speak louder than words. The fact that here we have King Charles going for his coronation with his authority still determined over Australia and other remaining colonies. Now, as we know, Fiji became a republic in 1970, even though, as I said, in the 1990s I used to see pictures of Queen Elizabeth II still hanging in government buildings. I don't know if that's still the case today. However, the Great Council of Chiefs was, in essence, a structure that was put in place by the British to help manage and administer the iTaukei within Fiji and allow for structure and development. I mean, the establishment of, as I've said, of the iTaukei, or Native Land Trust Board, has enabled land to be leased, albeit there are some problems with those leases. That's why, I'll get to in a moment, the Melanesian Indigenous Land Defence Alliance are vehemently against both the registration of land and interests in land, and also against leasing. So back to the Great Council of Chiefs and the fact we didn't get selected, and I wish Dr. Johnny Balndrocka and his team the very best in what they're doing, and I'm intrigued to find out what the outcome of their deliberations are, because it's a very short time frame. It's a 3.5 month period. In fact, now we're into 3 months until the findings are to be put forward for the re-establishment. Re-establishment, albeit that the Great Council of Chiefs are meeting on Bow Island later this month, for 22nd, 23rd, I think it is, for their first meeting in what will be 17 years since they were disestablished, or 19 years since they were disestablished. So the musings on what is needed will help shape the role of the aristocracy and the chiefly structure in Fiji going forward. Now, just because I feel that Australia should be a republic, that there really isn't a place for a monarchy even in the UK in the 2020s, does not mean that I am against having some form of structure that allows clarity and societal development. But obviously, what we may have come up with, from a more impartial perspective, could be quite different to what is put forward by the Johnny Balndrocka-led team. So when I was reflecting on our performance and the decision, I was reminded of something that we wrote in a paper on the Plurality of Registers back in 2015, paper for World Bank. And I think a quote from that, from our musings, because it does much to rationalise why we were perhaps not the favoured Great Council of Chiefs review team. And I quote from that paper, which I'll provide links to in the show notes. In such circumstances, a relationship-oriented process must encompass indirect and non-verbal communication to protect relationships and face. Accordingly, traditional societies often prefer locals to act as intermediaries, even though they may be party to the conflict, or in this case the issue, and partial to one side or another side based on community trust and respect. Such individuals are seen to have a longer-term interest in enduring solutions for the greater good of society than impartial outsiders do. I should have perhaps read that paper in the hurried preparations for crafting a proposal. And it may have given me pause for thought, it may not, but that level of impartiality that we might have brought to the equation is interesting. because we would have looked at the circumstances without fear or favour and without a sense of myth or embeddedness. Now, obviously, two of our team are iTaukei members, bringing skills from the legal perspective and the social policy perspective. But there is less of a vested interest, for want of better argument, in our impartiality, in looking at circumstances rationally to say, is this the best structure to enable customary land to be appropriately managed in Fiji in 2023 and forward? So it was very much a case of should there be and what should it look like in the context of a GCC, a Great Council of Chiefs 2.0. So that is an interesting dimension. Now, tied up with the whole notion of a Great Council of Chiefs is a whole aspect of myth, embeddedness, and tradition. Now, it's confusing in as much as if we say many Pacific Island countries were grouped in familial and tribal or village associations. It's a very interesting dynamic when we look at the historic aspects of how this occurred and how it was then formalized in Fiji. And it was formalized for the benefit of the colonizers. It was formalized for benefit of the British in their actions to have some sort of a structure so they knew who they were dealing with. But it also seems to have served to the advantage of the iTaukei, because it allows a hierarchy of authority and understanding. Now, so we're talking about an institution which was perceived as being functional and fit for purpose in 1945. Is it still functional and fit for purpose in 2023 as it was? Well, the previous government suggested otherwise, and that's why it was disestablished for some aspects of the reason why it was disestablished anyway. The same holds true of the British monarchy. You know, what was good for Britain, post-war Britain, when Queen Elizabeth II ascended to the throne in 1952 is quite a different set of circumstances to 71 years later, when we are in the realms of a coronation for King Charles III. You know, the monarchy served a role historically and gave structure to society historically. It was also the cause of, as I say, plundering of all of the colonies and the empire for pure self-interest, as we saw with the French and we've seen with the Germans and the Dutch and other countries as well. We've seen a level of plundering of colonization through the Pacific, through Asia, in Africa, and so forth. But whether or not the Fiji circumstances make the structure of the Great Council of Chiefs optimal in 2023 is very interesting. And it's something which I'm following closely because I think it has ramifications for elsewhere in the Pacific, because we have to remember that unlike other Pacific Island countries, Fiji also established the iTaukei Land Trust Board, so it has had a representation. And that's what I originally thought I was going to be talking about this week, the importance of representation. And that's legal, valuation, surveying, in the management of customary land. But that perspective isn't a consistent one. And let me here reflect on what we had as the first declaration of the 2002 Land Tenure Conflict Symposium, which I co-facilitated. The first declaration was aiming for peaceful and constructive transformation of land tenure conflict. Secondly, we live in a broader world. We acknowledge the clash between Indigenous values and capitalism. 3, we recognise that there are many stakeholders that should be acknowledged and consulted regarding land. 4, we're committed to sustainable long-term solutions that are fair to all, including equitable apportionment of returns from land. 5, we respect the different value systems of Indigenous peoples. 6, we acknowledge that Indigenous peoples see their relationship as coming from the land rather than as owning it as a commodity. 7, we acknowledge and respect the customary nature of land ownership and control in the Pacific. It does not prevent optimal use or development in its many forms. 8, we're committed to good governance in terms of land use and land tenure systems, incorporating wide participation at appropriate levels in both the private and public sectors, and equal recognition and empowerment. 9, we recognise the need for solutions at appropriate levels, local solutions for local problems, with the need for local acceptance and ownership of solutions. That comes back to that point that I made about the rationale and the decision of appointing a local team, purely local team, to the review of a Great Council of Chiefs. 10, we recognise the need to have processes that focus on building relationships and ensuring positive outcomes. 11, we accept the existence and possible value of non-violent conflict. 12, we recognise the need for goodwill between people. 13, we're committed to finding long-term solutions. Now, we went on to resolutions as a formal expression or opinion of intention agreed upon, which led us into a vision statement, which holds true, I think, as true today as it did, 21 years ago, last month, when we held the Symposium, which is strive for land reform that is both based on and sensitive to the reality of continuing customary ownership. I use the word land reform in that, or we use the word, should I say, land reform in that, and that's to show that we need to reflect on the effectiveness of institutions relating to land all the time. Is the monarchy appropriate? Is the GCC as an institution relating to the management of iTaukei land appropriate? Are our leasing structures appropriate, as I spoke to in episode 4? 2, adopt a stakeholder approach to land management at local, community, provincial and national levels. 3, respect and incorporate the best of customary and Western values in the process of land tenure conflict transformation. 4, aspire to a productive interface between Indigenous and Western information to ensure sustainable land use. 5, share the insights and understanding gained through the Symposium and subsequent initiatives with ordinary people and citizens. Well, 21 years later, I'm trying to do that for a podcast, obviously. 6, aim for equitable, by which we mean just, distribution of land rents. Now, we also put forward in the Symposium specific strategies to move on and to move forward. And this next one, I think, is one of the biggest conundrums, and it will make sense when I go to the soliloquy which I want to share from Joel Simo in a moment. So the first specific strategy is to explore and reach consensus on where people/citizens want to be located between the extremes of traditional customary ways and Western materialism. And here we are with, if we are to talk about the extreme of tradition and customary ways, we're observing that this very week in the UK situation, which is a perpetuation of myth, embeddedness and tradition, as opposed to the ways of contemporary Western materialism, particularly when we think that all land in the UK and here in Australia's ultimate ownership is vested in the Crown. And so we only have in fee simple absolute in possession a right of use, thereby grace of the Crown. And if the Crown or the state on the Crown's behalf want access to the land, they can acquire it for development purposes. Second strategy, as a starting point for further developments considerations, there's a need for baseline studies of the current situation in each of the South Pacific countries that needed to be assembled, setting out the legal context of current tenure systems, both the customary and the introduced systems. Current customary systems including informal and extra-legal land dealings, and what options there are for each country and the consequences and implications of each of those options. Now, in part, that was undertaken through the Pacific Island Forum Secretariat Land Tenure Conflict Minimization Project. I'll talk in other podcasts about that because that was overshadowed by an initiative from then AusAid, the Australian Development Agency, a project called Making Land Work. Now, making land work for whom? It was supposedly for the customary owners as well as other countries like Australia with vested interests and actually enabling development. But the AusAid project really did, I think, unfortunately, overshadow the much larger body of work that was undertaken more or less concurrently by the Pacific Island Forum Secretariat on and for and behalf of the forum members, as opposed to by AusAid specifically with the Making Land Work project. I'll return to that one perhaps in a subsequent podcast. Anyway, 3, building capacity in landowners to take an active part in decisions regarding their own land with mechanisms for more people, both landlords and tenants, to be able to express their views at various levels, with a need for ongoing meetings of ordinary people to know more about the solutions and networking to improve intergroup relationships, improve landlord and tenant relationships, improve role, place and responsibilities of intermediaries, and open transmission of information to explain issues, proposals to people where possible in the vernacular, in their own language. And 4, fourth strategy, explore more efficient and effective market institutions to provide an honest and fair return to all parties and establish an appellate body at an appropriate level to facilitate equity and social justice in resolving land disputes, and to revise customary structures that are no longer working. Okay, that brings in the question of the GCC in Fiji. It brings in the role of the NLTB or the iTaukei Land Trust Board, but we don't see similar structures in other Pacific Island countries. And we have redistribution timing to manage the transition to develop other activities. And 5, invite a neutral third party to review issues and mediate where consensus cannot be equitably obtained. 6, identify good land management practice and establish methods to share best practice. And again, a lot of that was talked about in the huge work undertaken. And when I say huge, I think it probably totaled around 1 million or more words and insights from Pacific Island Forum Secretariat to share best practice. Explore equity of compensation issues regarding infrastructure. Remove provincialism from a dialogue. And devise a more effective rental methodology to review allocation of rent aimed at equitable distribution and distributive justice, and avoid costly mechanisms. 10, optimize contemporary land geographic information systems and find ways of ensuring that the public will have access to these LIS and GIS databases. And 11, facilitate impartial scientific research to better understand land use and tenancy, the role and responsibilities of absentee landowners, and educate both lessors and lessees to create better understanding of lease terms, obligations, and responsibilities and covenants, especially termination and reversion issues, ensuring equity irrespective of gender and ethnicity. And the language, in 13, should be appropriate and effective. Adopt plain English style leases, officially translated into the local language of all signatories, and train facilitators, mediators who are sensitive to language and culture and adopt a positive attitude. So I think there's a huge amount to unpack in that, but most especially the need to determine where customary landowners want to be placed between the extremes of custom and tradition and of Western materialism and possessive individualism that comes with that. It's worth highlighting that there's a counterpoint to this perspective that we put out in the South Pacific Land Tenure Conflict Symposium, and more importantly, I think the counterpoint came as a result of the Making Land Work policy and the interventions that occurred in the Solomons through the Solomon Islands Institutional Strengthening Land Administration Project, and then the AusAid-funded Mamagroan project in Vanuatu, which caused a great deal of consternation because both those projects were somewhat land recording and registration driven. So in 2009, the Melanesian Indigenous Land Defence Alliance was established, and I quote here from their website. Established in 2009, the Melanesian Indigenous Land Defence Alliance, MILDA, is a regional civil society network that supports and coordinates community efforts to maintain control over our land, ocean, and resources. Recognizing threats to customary land systems, our intention is to unite, organize, and defend guardianship of Melanesian communities over our land, ocean, water, air, and natural resources. We assert that the customary systems are the basis of life and community in Melanesia. We aim to lead, coordinate, and support the effective functioning of the MILDA network by mobilizing to effectively address issues of concerns in Melanesia. Now, I've met a number of members of MILDA over the years and have always been quite inspired by their perspectives. And I think it is understandable that as a counterpoint, particularly to that Making Land Work initiative, that MILDA responded on the pendulum somewhat the other way to say, like, no leases, no registration, We work around the customary systems. So that actually recognizes an autonomy of Indigenous authority that doesn't or hasn't been seen as obviously in somewhere like Fiji, for example, which has moved to adopt more westernized approaches to land, maybe because of the very nature of the iTaukei Land Trust Board. Anyway, I have a transcript and a recording actually of the audio as well from a meeting I had with Joel Simo, who was then the director of the land desk at the Vanuatu Cultural Centre. Vanuatu Cultural Centre is where MILDA is located with its office. And this is taken from his response to the question, what is customary land? Posed at what was an AidWatch meeting in Sydney back in November 2014 as part of the Melanesian Indigenous Land Defence Alliance speaking tour. Customary land tenure. Why it's worth fighting for to protect. It has a lot of meaning for us. At independence, we struggled for that, we fought for it, and then we got it. The main issue for us was that land had to return to the customary landowners. Our founding fathers ensured that land is enshrined in the Constitution and belongs to the customary people. The roots of custom form the basis of ownership, not modern laws. So why we value traditional land so much in Melanesia is because land belongs to every member of the family, or every member of the clan, or every member of the tribe. It does not belong to an individual. Land is our land. It's not my land. The concept of individual ownership is a new concept in the region and Melanesia. We do not own land. We have the right to look after our land for the benefit of our children. Land is not a commodity. One of the big reasons that we've tried to defend this is because a large part of the population in Melanesia is rural-based. They live off the land, and everything that comes from the land sustains them. The traditional economy, that is their gardens, their houses, their mats, their pigs, their chickens, or whatever, belongs to the community, which is what we call the traditional economy. This sustains them. If they do not have any money in their pockets, they still survive. They have a roof over their head, and they still have food on the table. These are things that are very important, and all these things are taken from the land, not cash. One of the things that I think GDP fails to understand is that GDP is in monetary terms only, but ignores what the bulk of the population is living off in the region. These people are still living happily. There may not be any hospitals out in the community, but people still have food, they still have the basics, what they need in life. That's why people are so attached to land. Land and people are one. They're inseparable. Land is our life for us in Melanesia, especially where I come from in Vanuatu. The other part of it is this idea of saying that we have to bring development into the community so that it can provide employment. It can provide jobs to people. For us, land is the biggest employer, as despite the fact that you do not have a job or you're not educated, you still have some place to work to sustain yourself. With this, I think, this is one of the main reasons that we have to defend what has been sustaining us for thousands of years. What we're seeing now is this idea that you have to free up land for development purposes. In order to do that, we have to register those lands, and that is taking away the land from its traditional tenure to a new model of land that is ownership. But land is our land, not my land. Once we take it out of traditional tenure to this new system, it becomes my land and no longer our land. That's where disputes arise. That's where conflicts arise. Because one person in the community gets the land title and becomes a landowner, so other members of the community will retaliate because they cannot survive without the land. So these are the new things that are coming and that are gradually displacing people off their land. In Melanesia specifically, for the rural people, there is no landlessness. Everybody has somewhere to build a house. Everyone has somewhere to make a garden to survive. So that, in Melanesia land, is our actual safety net. You take it away from us, and you only have one option: to find a paid job, and good luck with finding that. And if you do, well, you've got nowhere to go. I guess this is one of the main reasons that there is no real poverty, if I can put it that way, in the rural community. And there they have houses, they have food, they have water. Maybe it's not coming from the tap, but it's still a running stream. It's everything. These things are life. If the land is taken away from the people, it raises the question of survival. How are they going to survive when they've not been taught how to survive in monetary terms? They're not taught how to be independent when you're using money. This has impacted on the community in many negative ways. When you put land into an individual realm, when it's no longer our land, it excludes others. You hold a lease, alienating the land and excluding others, excluding people from the land that has been part and parcel of their life for generations. The model of registration is being pushed by states. It's being pushed by government. It's being pushed by aid donors to free up land so that developments can come in. Then again, this raises the question of development for whom? What do we mean when we talk about development in our communities? This is a question that needs to be addressed properly. With this sort of model of land registration, the argument is that it will push development in the country. But if you look at this carefully, you have to displace people from the land so that these things can take place at the expense of customary landowners, so that others can benefit while the bulk of the population have been feeding off the land. And their land, not my land, are displaced. These are the reasons why in Vanuatu and Melanesia we talk a lot about land issues, because land is our life. Land is ours, not mine. When you put in place an individual realm, it becomes saleable, transferable. You put in a legal framework and it becomes transferable, and you will never, ever get back to its traditional understanding where it is invisible. Once it's gone, it's gone. So powerful stuff from Joel, and I think it contextualizes why the MILDA organization and also Act Now in Papua New Guinea are so significantly against the principles of registration and the notion of formalizing structures so that they are akin to Western understandings, so that you're in a situation where you've got the ability to record, register, create titles, and then create subsidiary interests. And herein lies one of the major problems, which I don't think is being fully acknowledged or dealt with by national governments trying to deal with some of their particular problems. the pressure on resources. And here we see, obviously, the Kanaki population are part of MILDA as well. The recognition that they should have, under the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, they should have the authority and autonomy over their customary lands. Not happening under the French system as a colony. Bougainville has had a referendum and is in the process of becoming autonomous, but not without massive upset and death as a result of the Bougainville Troubles, which started at the Panguna mine back in 1988. And only now is a class action being taken against Rio Tinto by the people who were impacted in Bougainville, both for the loss of their land, because there was of the mining activity, the contamination, and also the deaths that occurred in defending people's customary rights. So I'll include links in the show notes to the latest declarations from MILDA and the MILDA organisation. I'll provide links to Act Now. I'll also include the Plurality paper, which I have made reference to, or provide links to that. It exists on the resources page of Customary Land Solutions anyway, but I'll put direct links into the show notes so you can find it, because that explains in more detail how we have these plural worldviews. As I said, from the South Pacific Land Tenure Conflict Symposium Declaration, this plurality of needing to decide where people want to be placed between the extremes of custom and tradition and of Western materialism. So that provides us with, I suppose, a circular structure down to this bizarre situation that's happening in the UK with a perpetuation of myth and embeddedness. And nobody can really question or challenge customary landowners, the collective that is customary stewards and guardians of land, over being an alliance for defending their customs and traditions, which are all centred on the land, and challenging notions of Western materialism. As I say, there's a lot to digest within these issues, particularly I think in the insights that Joel shared, and also the fact that there is this counterpoint to things like leases, which I spoke about in episode 4, where I argued that leases may be part of the problem, but I do still see them as being part of a solution as well. But they have to be crafted properly. They have to be appropriate. And I think it's an interesting dimension and an interesting conversation to have with MILDA and Act Now, who are so against any form of new leasing over land. And that's because of the way leases have been handled in these countries. And they have been handled in a way that has disconnected people from the land. So that's swung the pendulum all the way against leases, which is interesting and important. So, as I say, there's a lot to digest, there's a lot to unpick, and it actually provides a basis for us to move forward into some of the other issues that I'm wanting to discuss in the podcast, such as how you get any form of equity if you've got mining, extraction, logging, or such things going on. So we will explore that in subsequent episodes in more detail. As always, I close with a disclaimer that the views and insights and opinions shared on the Customary Land podcast are those of a host and any guests and others that they may cite. They do not constitute legal or financial advice and should not be construed as such by any individual, group or organisation. Before undertaking any dealing or action relating to customary land, individuals, groups or organisations should obtain professional advice from a qualified lawyer, experienced valuer and/or certified chartered accountant with specialist expertise in your country. Alternatively, you can contact Customary Land Solutions for advocacy, advisory and capacity building solutions for customary and Indigenous landowning groups and trusts on land management, leasehold, valuation and resource compensation issues. Customary Land Solutions can be emailed at contact@customarylandsolutions.com. Alternatively, if today's episode has raised any particular issues for you, or you'd like to discuss anything with the Customary Land podcast, you can reach out to me direct at contact@thecustomarylandpodcast.com. So until the next episode, stay safe, stay well, and thanks for watching.